Hello, everybody, and welcome to a special interview here with the one and only Ian Hazzikostas. I think I said it right.
Yep, you nailed it.
Perfect. Talking about World of Warcraft Dragonflight because we're here. No, I didn't think anyone thought it was going to come this fast, but here we are.
I mean, arguably, we're on track for a couple of years since our last expansion. And I think if you told somebody that 2 years after the last WoW expansion, the new one's going to come out, everyone would think that was like right on track. I get, some concerns. Definitely heard feedback in the community that because it feels like alpha is starting later than some past expansions, there's concern. No one wants to feel like the expansion's not going to be as good as it could be. No one wants to feel like it's in any way being rushed. I'd like to reassure you and reassure everyone that nothing could be farther from the truth. Dragonflight has been in development since well before Shadowlands released. We had plans in place and things have been proceeding according to plan. The main thing we're doing a bit differently this time around is a somewhat different and more focused approach to our alpha and upcoming beta testing. I think in past expansions, for folks who have joined us or followed our alphas, often we would get it started pretty early, but then have stretches of time without too much in the way of new updates, and kind of slowly roll things out as they came online. It might have taken 3 months between Battle for Azeroth's alpha starting and zones like Vol'dun or Stormsong being playable for testing.
Mm-hmm.
This time around, we have an exciting summer planned. We have a more focused testing plan where, in this first build that you've been checking out, we have Azure Span as a zone playable. Next week, it's going to be the Forbidden Reach, the Drakthir Evoker starting experience. Then after that, the Waking Shores, the first zone of our leveling experience. And after that, as we roll them out one after another, with more classes coming online for talent tree testing and feedback, dungeons, professions, and all the rest. So it should be a pretty uninterrupted flow of content that can really focus feedback and, avoid some of the lulls that I think we found are a bummer for people who would get invited to the alpha, be excited to test stuff, and then go a while without anything new and drift away.
Yeah, I think that was a common issue because people be like, "Oh, I'm in," and then they test a bit, and then your attention fades, and then they stop testing. One of my main questions I wanted to ask was with dragon riding. So with dragon riding coming out in Dragonflight, is this a step forward in changing how mounted movement works for all World of Warcraft, or is this just like an expansion only type of, artifact weapon thing?
That's a great question. The power is in your hands and the community's hands, really. It's planned as an expansion-specific experiment, but all experiments are planned with the hope they could become something greater. And if, as this continues to unfold, I think certainly initial reactions are promising, but let's see how it feels once everyone's playing with it, going through the progression and upgrading their ability to fly around. If, this just feels like an all-around upgrade to the flying that we've known in the past, then it's something we'd love to explore, carrying forward. We'd have to look at, how we extend these capabilities to a range of other mounts, because I think a big point of sensitivity for us is, people have these huge mount collections that don't all necessarily have the animations and banking and support for all of the new tech that goes into dragon riding. We don't want to do anything that would ever invalidate people's collections that they've poured, years of their lives into amassing. But if we can make the overall experience better, then we want to chase that path for sure.
Is there going to be almost like attachments you can put on dragon riding, or could that be something added in the future, like, oh, now I'm moving faster, or whatever it might be?
Also, I think, not totally sure, maybe I misunderstand, but visually you can certainly customize your dragon companion with a bunch of attachments there in terms of things like armor and different skins and textures and horns and so forth. And there's also separately a progression system where just through exploring the world, collecting these dragon runes that are scattered around the Dragon Isles and completing some other content, you can upgrade your vigor reserves, the rate at which they recharge, and just get better at flying itself.
I see. Yeah, that's kind of what I meant. Almost like, oh, can you get a saddle that makes you go faster, like that type of thing?
Gotcha. Yeah, it's more of a built-in, it's more just mastery over your, over the skill and strengthening your bond with your companion more than any equipment pieces.
Okay, I see. That kind of leads me into the zone size, because I noticed that the zones are very big, and I take it that is kind of to play into dragon flying a bit. So were the zones designed because of Dragonflight, or vice versa?
It's a bit of a chicken and egg thing. Like, I think we knew that we wanted to offer some type of new traversal mechanism from the start of the expansion. Like, it's a dragon themed expansion. I think doing the usual, you're on the ground for X months and then you can learn how to fly, felt like the wrong fit for a world that we wanted to build, not just to, have dragons centrally part of it, but also to be a space that is inhabited by winged beings. And you'd expect a lot of verticality, and, making a place that's a pain to navigate isn't in anyone's interests. And so that was part of it. But we also actively wanted to build in more negative space, as we call it, kind of between our areas of interest, to make the world feel more like an organic world to be explored with nooks and crannies and people living their lives, as opposed to, at times in the past, I think some of our zones have been a bit denser than we would prefer in retrospect, where it almost felt like everything was there to serve a gameplay purpose, and it's a lot of things that are kind of piled on top of each other without much room for the world to breathe in between. And I think that the impression that people get as they arrive and start exploring the Dragon Isles is, so far, I think, what we've been aiming for. We want it to feel like a very inviting land, and for the expansion to have, a feeling of openness and exploration to it.
Yeah, I definitely got that feeling just from like going back in, because I said it almost felt like it was a blend of like Grizzly Hills meets like Azshara meets like some Northrend other zones mixed in there, but it was just like all in one zone, which I thought was wild.
Awesome. Yeah, that's I mean, those are for sure some of the inspirations. So glad to hear that's landing.
Yeah. Speaking of which, there's Tuskarr there. Which I love, because I love fishing. I love Tuskarr, and then, it's all right there. But that led me to be curious, are there going to be new allied races in this expansion, and would any of them be Tuskarr, or is that something you can't talk about?
There are no allied races currently planned, though it's a system that we have that for sure we're very open to, using where it makes sense, where through our journeys, we encounter new cultures that, we could see joining the Alliance or the Horde or both. We'll see where that leads us down the line. But for Dragonflight right at launch, no, our focus is on the Drakthir as the new race.
All right. So I brought up fishing, so I wanted to kind of swap over to professions here, because obviously it seems like right away you're even hit with fishing. So it's obviously, it feels like a focal point. And, I love fishing. I did like an entire series of fishing with people. And so in Legion, I thought fishing was like at its peak. Like, it was fan. You had the artifact fishing pole, you had like all this stuff. And then it felt like in Shadowlands, it was almost like at the complete opposite end. And so I'm curious as if that's getting updated with the professions as like secondary professions and stuff like that.
Honestly, I think Dragonflight's going to land somewhere in between. I think our focus for profession overhauls has for sure been on the sort of the primary crafting professions. I think especially the item making, armor making professions that have really often struggled to feel relevant later on in the expansion. And so that's where we've really put the bulk of our efforts. But fishing is for sure, culturally relevant to what's going on in the Dragon Isles, integrated and has interactions with a bunch of these other professions. It's something we want to do more with. We know, like, fishing is, a great pastime for tons of people. It's a nice chill activity, particularly when you're in a place as beautiful as the Dragon Isles. It's good to have more reasons to just, spend some time enjoying the scenery and progressing your profession.
Yeah. And speaking with secondary professions, I guess archaeology. I saw an interview of you with Hazel, and you mentioned that archaeology was kind of just, kind of like a side thing that wasn't really going to get much attention. But then when I was actually playing yesterday, I noticed there was a dwarf who's like, oh, there's all this archaeology out here. And I was like, well, then why is he here if there's like no archaeology? So
we have, there's the Dragon Scale expedition. There's a group, there's certainly groups that are studying the relics and ancient, artifacts of the Dragon Isles. And that sort of theming is definitely there, and there's content tied into it. What we aren't carrying forward just yet is the like old school triangulation archaeology of, okay, you're doing a research project and you're playing random fragments. We think we want to do better than that. But I think that's something at this point we're looking to do in patches over the course of Dragonflight, and then hopefully find a model that can be, a framework for archaeology going forward. Because I think a lot of the feedback we'd heard when we, for thematic reasons, didn't make sense in Shadowlands when we skipped it for Shadowlands. There weren't a whole lot of tears being shed over that.
Yeah.
Which is a good sign that, like, we can do better than this. And so that's something we want to return to and really give it more attention down the line.
So with the primary professions then, I'm kind of curious because you've mentioned like they almost have their own talent trees, or even they do have their own talent trees. And I was curious, like, is this going to be more of a almost like a spec that you go down, or is this kind of like with old school engineering, how you would all do engineering and then you'd hit like, oh, I do goblin or I do gnome engineering?
So it's a bit of both, in the sense of there are a lot of specializations and subspecializations within the professions, so that you can choose to get bonuses, efficiency bonuses, quality bonuses as a blacksmith to making armor, but then beyond that to making helms specifically, let's say. But unlike picking specializations back in the day, it's not like a one-time dead-end binary choice. It's actually more like artifacts back in Legion, where eventually you can get everything. Eventually, it's like, what are you going to get first? And then what will you get second and third and so forth? So people don't have to worry about, oh man, I made the wrong choice and I specialized in the wrong thing. But what it does is actually like, it's a more elaborate, deeper version of like a random old school system that I always thought worked really well for professions was the way like jewel crafting recipes worked back in Wrath Village King. It was a random, ancient pull. Where it was just, you were getting currency and spending that currency on specific recipes, which meant that like as a jewel crafter on a server, you could look at what was in short supply in your server or what cuts your guild mates needed or whatever else and get those, while someone else might get something different. And at its core, a lot of what's interesting about crafting is differences among crafters. Specialization is, if everyone can make everything the same as everyone else, then okay, you just have to go find a person to click the button for you. But when you can have an identity as the person who provides this service as distinct from others who've chosen to specialize elsewhere, that is interesting socially, economically, and I think is more fulfilling as an experience for the crafter themselves.
So is it one of those things where almost like as you progress, do things get easier to make in a more masterful way? Like you have a higher chance of creating something really good the higher up you are?
Yeah, it's a lot of that. It's both the ability to make the thing in the first place, as you're getting to the more powerful stuff, but also, as we laid out on a recent blog, there are quality ratings for different items. You can still upgrade items through the quality tiers. We want to make sure this doesn't feel like a very RNG driven system. There's a chance for like positive random outcomes that feel good, but even if you get the baseline outcome, it's fine. You still can put more resources in and get to the best version down the line anyway. But yes, it's getting better at all of those aspects of it. Also acquiring fewer materials or getting some of your materials refunded potentially, depending on the type of crafts. All these things, can be big perks for someone who is really into the economic aspect of crafting, who wants to perform, complete work orders for people across their server, buy materials, buy the raw materials, turn them into items and sell them at a profit. Like all of these specializations will help you with that side of it too.
That's cool. So speaking of RNG, I wanted to tie in mount farming because currently I pretty much just mount farm. Like that is my thing I love doing. You just go to all the old raids and you're like, what's my 1 in 100 chance today? And you're like, hey, I hit it. So I was curious as if there's going to be a lot of kind of farmable mounts, because I almost noticed that in BFA there's actually a decent amount. It felt like there's the hyena mount and there's the llama, the little bug tick thing. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff, and then it almost felt like in Shadowlands it was almost like a 1 in 25, a 1 in 50, or it almost didn't feel as farmable or grindy, which in a way I guess could be good, but for some people they prefer that grind. So I was curious what it was going to be like in this expansion.
Interesting. Now that you put it that way, that's interesting feedback, just thinking about how that played out. I don't know that it was necessarily deliberate. I think it was just the product of a lot of local choices that just kind of ended up landing in a certain place. We haven't nailed down exactly where every mount is going to come from yet. I think we have a cool array of mounts that we know will be available as rewards. The process of like mapping those rewards to the different sources is one that usually happens a bit closer to, everything being locked down once we know exactly where all the content has landed. But I think, philosophically, we want there to be a range when it comes to mounts, and some should be relatively easy to get. Some are a product of dedication and you're just making progress towards a fixed goal. Some require just great displays of skill. And then at least a handful are those like, you're lucky mounts that, that become the things that some people will get it on the first try. Some will be trying for quite a while. And we don't want to have too many of those either,
Right.
but I think they're useful as just being the handful of outliers that are there as things to chase and get excited about.
Yeah. And speaking of that, is it possible to add a Siege of Orgrimmar skip? Because I lose my mind every time I go there.
That's a yes. Actually, that's feedback we've heard from a few different sources. It's something we should look at. Like, I know we started adding skips not too long after that. I think like Hellfire Citadel.
Mm-hmm.
Blackrock Foundry was the first one.
Yeah.
And so, Siege of Orgrimmar is a huge raid. Understandably, would be nice to be able to jump ahead a bit. We'll see what we can do there.
All right, great. Yeah, that's the one that every week I'm like, man, I don't want to do that this week. So I guess going into talent trees, I'm kind of curious as if you got your inspiration from classic WoW with the talent trees, or even like Wrath of the Lich King, or just the old school talent trees, and then it just felt like the current ones weren't living up to what they were supposed to be.
That's definitely part of it. We've gotten feedback from the community over the years about people missing the old talent trees, and I think being able to see how they played out in Classic and Burning Crusade Classic over the last few years in the modern era, I think kind of reminded us and reaffirmed for us that, like, yep, we lost something here for sure. We really did. And so, a few years ago, really, we started thinking about what an evolution of our talent system might look like, what it would look like to blow up the whole thing and start over. We explored a lot of different directions, but ultimately settled on something that is, closer to what the original talent trees were in terms of, a point every level, flexibility in, just the micro decisions that you're making with branching choices. But I think one of the two big adaptations that we made, I think we're first recognizing that unlike in the game 15 years ago, today spec has become really enshrined as like a fundamental aspect of your identity. Mm. People aren't just a mage, they're a fire mage or an arcane mage with wildly different rotations, action bars that can look completely different. And that just wiping all that away and going back to, oh yeah, you just have a mage talent tree and you're building among this, I think would have lost a big piece of that and been potentially too alienating for people who love their characters and the way they play today. The second, so I think that's why we kept spec as something that you choose explicitly, unlike 15 years ago. Second piece of it was really, I think, a flaw in the old system that is part of what led us to move to mist style talents to begin with, which was the feeling that, like, well, it's really hard to make meaningful choices here because there's a right answer that gets mapped out. Yes, there's cool utility stuff, but I'm always going to pick the throughput stuff that just makes me better at doing damage or healing or whatever else.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, what led us to separate out into two trees, into having, if you're a druid, if you're a restoration druid, you have your druid talent points that you can spend in your druid tree, and your resto points you can spend in the resto tree. And all the things in the resto tree are going to make you a better healer. They're going to increase your healing throughput, give you more options, more tools, and you're choosing among like things. Whereas over in the druid tree, there's a little bit of throughput, but there's also a lot of chance to explore the hybrid side of your class and decide whether you want more Moonkin hybridity and the ability to do some nukes from a distance, or more survivability or movement or whatever else. And you're not giving up healing throughput. You're not being asked to weaken your wild growth in order to get that, extra movement ability, because we know the right answer there. So I think this in practice should, even in the modern era of theory crafting and, relatively solid systems and a min-max approach to a lot of this, give people some really interesting deep choices to customize their characters for different situations.
Yeah, I think people just miss that kind of in-depth level of customization, even if it's going to be like, oh, I know the meta build is to go exactly this way, but it almost still feels good to be like, you know what, maybe I'm going to go off meta a little bit and do like, a couple points here because I really like that ability. And, it's like not everybody's going to be like the top 1% raiders or something trying to, clear it as fast as possible. I'm also curious about, this is almost like a completely off-topic one too, but this is what I love about the game. WoW holidays. So I'm curious as if you're going to update the WoW holidays, like the Midsummer Fire Festival and Brewfest and a lot of those, because it almost feels like when you go to those now, it feels like they're just from 2011 a lot of the times. Even like Brewfest,
Often
it's
a
like
reason for that.
yeah. And I'm curious as if you would update those, or if you thought about updating, because I do think they're like a fun little social aspect to the game, but obviously you don't want to dedicate, all your time to upgrading those.
Not all of our time, but some of our time for sure. I think we have made little, extra mini games and updates to things like Brewfest, the Darkmoon Fair, but it's something we want to keep doing, over time. I think that patches and patch content end up being a really ideal place for that sort of thing. It's not what we would do in a main expansion release, but as we look ahead to our Dragonflight patch plan and we want to have, more frequent patches that can be more flexible in terms of their size and the sorts of things they're delivering to players over the course of the next year, holiday updates, I think, are something that feel like a very natural fit there. And so some of that is looking at which holidays need the most attention because they're kind of getting long in the tooth. And also a lot of it is just driven by really cool ideas and passion projects that someone might have for, overhauling something or another. And that immediately moves it to the top of the list. But that's content and stuff that, they happen every few months. People are still going to them 10 years later and experiencing them for the very first time. We want to make sure they still hold up.
So one thing I actually wanted to ask you is what your favorite thing to work on this expansion was, and then I guess I'll ask the other one right after that.
It's tricky. So, speaking frankly, these days, most of my time is meetings and playtesting, and stuff directly. I'm going to say probably the talent system. I think that watching the team brainstorm and explore different directions and settle on this concept and prove it out with a couple of initial trees, coming from the starting point of we should redo our talent system, to the massive undertaking of doing so while preserving 18 years of expectations and history and abilities and structure, is a tremendous challenge. And it's been really cool just seeing the team work through that and get to this, where we are today.
Yeah, that is really cool. And my follow-up question kind of ties into that too, which was, what was just your favorite expansion to play or work on, just overall?
Timely, I guess, given what's coming out soon. I'm probably biased here, but I've got to say Wrath. For me, it's the intersection. I joined Blizzard not long before Wrath came out. I was able to contribute a little bit to some early Wrath content, worked on Ulduar and raid zones after that, and did class design. But also, at the time, my guild didn't know that I worked at Blizzard, and I was still living a full life as a player and raiding. And so really was my entire life was WoW for those couple of years. And I was just drinking from the fire hose, learning everything there was to learn about how to make WoW, while also, playing it super hardcore too. That kind of overlap of those two eras of my life as both a dedicated player and someone who, helps make the game, I think will forever make that unique.
That's awesome. So does that mean you're going to play Classic Wrath in a few months when it's out or whatever?
Definitely going to check it out. I think, unfortunately, the sad reality is my time is probably better spent helping make Dragonflight better versus reprogressing, Eye of Eternity and everything else. But it's going to be fun to watch it unfold. Yeah.
Well, that should be it. I think we're out of time. So thanks for joining me. I appreciate answering all these questions.
Absolutely. No, thank you for the great question. It's been fun chatting.
Yeah. See you later.